Good evening and welcome to Iowa News and Views. My name's Joe Balcom. I'm the host of the program. We're doing a program here today in Iowa City at the almost remodeled PATV studios. Thanks for joining us. The name of our program tonight is 30 Very Long Years, and I'm going to let you try and guess what that means. It is September 24th, the day of this taping. Our guest today is Democratic candidate for governor Tom Vilsack. But before we get to Tom, I want to do an update from our last show. Last time we talked about the call by state Republican leaders to reinstate the property tax freeze, and during that program I noted that a number of those leaders, legislative leaders, had not served in local government and had not really maybe had the best understanding of how local property tax system worked. And on that show I noted that Ross Lightfoot served on the Texas City Commission. As a matter of fact, it wasn't the Texas City Commission. I want to correct that. It was the Corsicana, Texas City Commission, and he served between 1974 and 1976. I just wanted to correct the record on that point. That property tax issue continues to be a debate, and I hope you'll pay attention to it. Our guest this evening is State Senator Tom Vilsack, who's also a Democratic candidate for governor, and we're pleased to have you with us.
It's great to be here, Joe.
Tom, 30 very long years refers to the fact that in Iowa we're the longest state in the nation with Republican control or one-party control over the governorship. What's the impact of that on programs and on how state government does its job?
Well, I'm using an agricultural metaphor to explain people the impact. Our farmers understand that if you plant the same seed on the same ground year after year, your yields start to go down. That's why our farmers rotate their crops. When you don't rotate the political crops, what you have is a bureaucracy that basically has the same philosophy for 30 years. It's fairly entrenched. And I think you're beginning to see signs of the impact of that in our education system, some decline in our educational standards. That's a real concern for me.
Good. Elections are about issues and differences between candidates on issues. To kind of get rolling here, what would you say are the major issue differences between you and your opponent?
Well, the fundamental difference is what we want to do with our state resources, whether we want to provide tax cuts for the wealthiest of Iowans, as we have done over the last several years, or whether we want to provide real property tax relief and a real commitment to education. I have laid out a very extensive program for improving our schools, starting with reducing class sizes, restoring discipline into our schools, requiring competency testing, creating forgivable loan programs so people can access higher education, and just today announced a program for helping schools out with their infrastructure needs. Mr. Lightfoot's sole issue has been tax cuts for the wealthy, and that fundamentally is the difference between the two of us.
I see. Maybe it's a good time to talk about tax cuts. I've got a chart here. Our graphics department has been hard at it, as usual, putting together a couple graphs, and see if we can get these. This is a recent report by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy that indicates that between 1992 and 1998, we've seen a shift in taxes from those being paid by people that are fairly well off in our state onto middle income and low income folks, and we've seen that increase. Essentially a tax cut to the richest 20%, where we're going below the line, and a tax increase for middle and low income families in the bottom 60%. All right, so when we've had a lot of talk about tax cuts over the last few years in Iowa. Everybody's getting them, more than we can handle, but when you look at the data, it indicates that poor folks and middle income folks are actually seeing tax increases, while richer folks have seen a cut.
Well, there are two reasons for that, Joe. First of all, we had a sales tax increase that is helping to fund some of the tax cuts that are now being provided to the wealthiest of Iowans. So sales tax is a very regressive tax, and basically working and middle class families pay a disproportionate share of sales tax for that. Secondly, property taxes have increased because the state has failed to adequately and fully fund its obligations, and so it has transferred responsibilities to local government without the resources to pay for those responsibilities. Property taxes have increased. That too is a regressive tax. In exchange for increasing these regressive taxes, what we've seen is a decrease or across-the-board income tax cut and inheritance tax cuts, which benefit primarily the wealthy.
Sure. Here's another chart. Since the graphics department's been so good in doing this, we'll go ahead and show this. This is all incomes, or all sources of taxes. The first chart was just sales tax and income tax. This is all the forms of taxes. And it basically indicates that people in the middle pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes. People that make not very much money, average $14,000, pay 11%, and people, the richest 1% or wealthiest 1%, pay about 6.8% of their taxes. And if we have a tax system that's based on ability to pay, which I think we generally agree is the fairest way to do taxes, we've got our system's kind of askew here.
Well, it's not only askew in terms of who receives the benefit of tax cuts, because if you take a look inside the numbers, the middle-class taxpayers, those people who make less than, say, $75,000, who earn around 50% of the income, pay 62% of the tax. So it's unfair in that respect. It's also unfair because there are services that are being impacted and affected by the nature of tax cuts. And Mr. Lightfoot has proposed, again, another massive round of tax cuts aimed principally at across-the-board income tax cuts of 25%. I'm really concerned that when you go that deep and that far, what you do is you really compromise our ability to deliver on our education, which I think is the most critical need and demand and is the single most important issue in this election.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly how we fund government is on people's minds, and it seems like there's a lot of talk about what people are going to do for us, but when you look at the facts, it's kind of concerning, particularly for most people,
You bet.
In terms of middle and lower income folks. Let's talk a little bit about education. That seems to be one of the themes of this campaign and both campaigns. What are the challenges in Iowa's education system now, and what's your proposals to try and address those?
Well, we've seen three basic trends recently which have been announced. First of all, our ACT rankings are below. We're no longer #1 in ACT rankings. Secondly, we've seen a gradual decline since 1990 in our basic skill testing for youngsters, particularly in reading competency. And last, we've seen an increase in tuition costs at our institutions of higher learning, at community colleges, and at the Regents University. I believe that part of that is a result of the legislature's decision to inadequately fund education to finance the very tax cuts we just got finished talking about. So what do we have to do? Well, first of all, we have to reduce class sizes in the early grades. And we're asking some teachers in some school districts across this state to teach 30 or 35 children in kindergarten, first, second, or third grade. Very difficult to teach the basics well when you've got that many students. Secondly, we got to restore confidence in the public education system in the sense that we've got to make sure that when we say we're teaching something, that we are in fact teaching it. That's why I've called for reading competency testing at the end of third grade. Let's check and see how well the kids are reading. If they're not reading at grade level at the end of third grade, then let's get them some help to make sure that they are reading well. Also, I think there's a deepening concern about discipline in the classroom. There are successful programs in Iowa City and Cedar Rapids and Sioux City that need to be replicated across the state to provide additional resources and people power in schools to handle children who are disruptive, children who are at risk of being disruptive. Let's shepherd them and mentor them through the process. Let's give them an opportunity to learn, and let's at the same time restore order and calm to the classroom so that the other students have an opportunity to learn as well. We also need to take a look and pay attention to infrastructure, both technological and building. I've suggested an expansion and a continuation of the technology fund, and finally, I've suggested that we take the gaming revenues that we're currently putting in the general fund, take them out of the general fund, put them in a special Rebuild Iowa's School Fund. This fund would be made available to school districts on a revolving loan basis. It would be funded initially at $60 million a year for at least 5 years, so it would be a fund of $300 million eventually. It would provide low-interest loans to schools that are interested in fixing their schools up to correct the fire and safety violations they currently have, to modernize so that they can introduce technology into their buildings, and finally, if they want to add additional classes, to reduce the class space and classroom student-teacher ratios, they can do so. Now, that is compared to Mr. Lightfoot's proposal. And I really can't talk very much about his education proposal because all he's talked about is taking a #2 lead pencil and putting it to a yellow line tablet and a return to basics. But what I can tell you is the tax cut proposal that he has proposed is not only reckless, but it will undermine our ability to adequately and fully fund education at a time when Iowa must invest in education if we're to be competitive in a global economy.
One of the issues that's come out just in the last week are tuition increases at the state regents institutions, University of Iowa, UNI, and Iowa State, roughly 5%, or approximately 5%, at least at Iowa. I don't know. What's your sense about that? Is that, can can students afford that kind of increase, and what would be your position on?
Most of the students that I've talked to are borrowing money to finance their college education, so any tuition tax increase is a difficult one for them to accept. The Board of Regents are faced with a difficult dilemma. They want to continue to provide quality education, but at the same time they're not getting the level of funding and support from the state that would allow them to avoid these kinds of tuition increases. If we want to avoid these kinds of tuition increases, then the state has to provide sufficient resources to the Board of Regents universities so that they don't have to always look to tuition. Here's what's happened. Governor Branstad has inadequately funded the community college system, and what we've seen are tuition increases to the point where we now rank 15th in the nation in tuition costs for community colleges. While we are still low in ranking in terms of the Big 10 and the Big 12 schools and the Iowa State and University of Iowa, we still can't afford to continue ratcheting these tuition costs up because we're pricing kids out of a higher education. And Joe, let me tell you how important higher education is if you're concerned about income. If you don't graduate from high school in Iowa today, you make about $15,000 a year on average. If you do, you make about $23,000 a year. If you graduate from a 4-year college program, you make around $38,000. And if you're fortunate enough to go to graduate school and get a graduate degree, your average income is about $61,000. The higher the income, the higher the education. There's a correlation there.
It reminds me of the problem we have with Social Security now in terms of being able to fund Social Security for people like us that are baby boomers in the future. Having a well-educated workforce is an investment in long-term retirement through that program as well.
And Iowa faces today a skilled labor shortage. Not only do we face an overall labor shortage, but more importantly, it's a skilled labor shortage. And we are not going to be able to fill that labor shortage unless we have incentives to individuals to access higher education. That's why I've got a series of forgivable loan programs that encourage students to get into some of these skilled shortage areas.
I see. There's been some interest around the state regarding tobacco, the tobacco issue, and in particular the ability of young people, minors, to get tobacco products. What's your sense about that? Are we doing enough to?
Well, clearly we're not doing enough in the sense that still today thousands of Iowans and of Iowa children get hooked on tobacco at a very early age. The first step in the process, it seems to me, is to strengthen the hand of the Attorney General in his case against the tobacco industry, to hold it responsible for encouraging youngsters to become involved in smoking. If the Attorney General were to be successful in that lawsuit, I think what we would see is a widespread public education program and resources that would really provide us an opportunity to significantly reduce tobacco use. Also, I think we ought to take a look at providing local communities the ability, if they so choose, to provide restrictions on access. I've supported some of the laws that have recently been passed to avoid access by closing down vending machines, by transferring and assigning the sale of individual cigarette packets behind the counter and those kinds of things. So they need to continue.
Good. You're watching Iowa News and Views. My name's Joe Balcom, host of the program, county supervisor also in Johnson County. We are talking about 30 long years, actually 30 very long years. It's September 24th. Our guest is candidate for governor, Democratic candidate, State Senator Tom Vilsack. Thanks for joining us. I also want to tell you about our Iowa News and Views webpage, learn about who's been on the show, upcoming shows, the schedule of the shows, and how you can get involved. We were interested in your ideas for guests and topics. I'd like to thank those people that sent in questions for today's guest and today's show. Back to our topic, future of our state. Yes. One of the issues that came out just this week was the Iowa Supreme Court's decision to basically throw out ag areas, or at least the nuisance protection that agricultural areas, which basically would allow farmers to get together and establish an area, which would be maybe so many acres, and anything that happened in those acres, people couldn't bring nuisance suits. Well, the Supreme Court said this week that was unconstitutional. What's the impact, do you think, of that decision on the whole large lot hog confinement agricultural animal issue in Iowa right now?
Well, I think it calls into serious question the application of House File 519. The court's ruling essentially indicated that such a law creating a special privilege constitutes a taking by government of the surrounding property owners' property rights and property values, which could potentially, if it's not responded to or addressed, could expose the state or the county to tremendous liability for reimbursing property owners for their loss of value. I think it's clear that what's going to happen is that this whole issue needs to be revisited, and we will once again give a state government the opportunity to do it right. Now, doing it right involves, first of all, putting faith and confidence in local officials to be able to work with local farmers to provide adequate and appropriate sites for large livestock facilities. We need local control of siting. Secondly, I think we need a much stronger effort at monitoring our ground and surface water by the state to ensure that we can guarantee to the public the sanctity and purity of our water. We also need to make sure that our DNR is adequately staffed to enforce the rules and regulations we have. We need to crack down on repeat violators. Fining them is obviously not enough to prevent them from doing and from mismanaging their facilities. Let's provide the state with greater opportunities to shut these operations down if they continually violate the environmental laws. And finally, to the extent that we try to provide protections from nuisance lawsuits, let's make sure that we still preserve the right of property owners to have a legal remedy in the event that their property is invaded by odor or whatever activity might constitute a nuisance.
Mm-hmm. When we talk about enforcing existing laws on the books, it brings us back to this 30 long years question, where you have the same folks making administrative appointments to, like, the head of the Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Human Services, and whether or not laws are going to be enforced and how effective we are.
Every board and commission, 30 years of the same philosophy in charge. With reference to the DNR, just to give you an example, last year we passed additional changes to House File 519. The theory was that this was somehow going to make it better. We asked the Legislative Fiscal Bureau to tell us how many additional staff people would be required to adequately enforce these new sets of regulations. We were told 22 new positions. Well, the legislature and the governor only funded 9. Well, you're setting yourself up for failure. That's why we need a change. That's why we need to rotate our political crops.
Great. House File 519 is the bill that addressed all our concerns about large hog confinements.
That's correct.
All right.
That's right.
Disability issues are certainly on people's minds in Iowa, and making sure that we provide adequate services and supports and get people back into the workforce and the like. Sally Peterson is your running mate, very involved in disability issues. What can we expect from your administration on disability issues?
Well, first of all, there is a real commitment to people with disabilities to provide them the opportunity to become productive members of society, to give them an opportunity to work. You know, this is a fundamental difference between myself and Mr. Lightfoot. He voted against the American with Disabilities Act, the only Iowa representative from Congress to do so. He still doesn't believe in the concept of the ADA. We do. Sally Peterson has a son, Ronald, and Ronald is a child with autism. She's been heavily involved in working with the nonprofit sector to try to create opportunities for people with disabilities. Her goal, my goal, our goal is to break the barriers down that currently exist to accessing help and assistance for people with disabilities, make government friendly to folks with disabilities so that they really can access a meaningful opportunity. We have a labor shortage in this state. We have literally hundreds, and I suspect thousands, of people with disabilities who are interested in being productive citizens who want to work. Let's find a way to put them to work.
Good. Iowa last session passed this legislation establishing empowerment zones, and that basically established a structure, loose structure, that would take state grant money and give it to the local communities. Local communities would organize boards and basically establish some administrative ability to provide services, basically right now, to children and families. Is that legislation going to work, and are there changes that we need to be made to see that through?
Well, it's too soon to say whether it's going to work or not. There are several concerns. One is whether or not the individuals at the local level fully understand and appreciate the significant responsibility that will be associated with deciding where these grant monies are to go. And secondly, has the state provided the local officials with a clear set of objectives that need to be accomplished with these empowerment zones? My sense is that we haven't provided local individuals, local folks with a clear understanding of what the expectation is. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? And until you have a clear expectation of what you want to accomplish, then it's very difficult to know whether you're on the right track or not. So I think you will see this area revisited so that the state can provide more direction. I think that we want, as a state, to say to local officials, these are the results that we want from this grant money, but you figure out how within your community these results can best be obtained. That's the kind of flexibility I think a lot of local officials are looking for.
I see.
It's interesting to note this, though, that there's a constant conversation about empowering local officials, but getting back to the hog issue, it's Mr. Lightfoot's position and the Republican position not to empower local officials.
Right.
The same thing is true with the decision to reinstitute the property tax freeze. That's another indication, I think, of a lack of confidence in local government officials. It's particularly upsetting when you realize that the state has failed to adequately and fully fund credits, provided unfunded mandates to local officials, and then suggests in some way that local officials are not doing their job.
Right. Last time, if you recall, viewers, we visited about that with some representatives from the State Association of Counties, and we generally feel it's very disingenuous for the Republican leadership to be basically pointing their fingers at county supervisors who are incredibly accountable to taxpayers. When we work on the county budget, we pay very close attention to every dollar, and to suggest that we don't seems to be more of a political issue for this election than, frankly, anything about good government.
And to suggest that somehow a property tax freeze will in the long haul result in reduced property taxes is inappropriate, because what you do is you create a system of pent-up demand. If we're really to reform property taxes, the first thing that, and I've proposed that we do this, first of all, the state needs to assume full responsibility for the payment of mental health costs. Property owners should not be paying for mental health. Secondly, the state needs to assume greater responsibilities for special education funding, which today is disproportionately paid for by property owners. Then the third step is we need to have a commission made up of people who are interested in modernizing our property tax system so that we identify what services we expect property taxes to pay for, and those services and only those services should be paid for by property tax. Then everything else either needs to be paid for by a different taxing process, or it may not be a proper function of state government. But if you really are interested in reducing property taxes, then you have to identify what services you want property tax to pay for, and that's the only service the property tax should pay for.
That's what, I mean, that's really the flip side of it. We can talk about cutting taxes all we want, but there are services attached to those, like jails and human services and emergency services and roads. Something's got to give. You just can't say.
Right, and if those are proper functions of government, as the ones that you've identified, it seems to me are, then there needs to be a way to find how to finance them, and then the question is, are they appropriately financed through property tax, or is there some other mechanism for financing them? That's why in our school situation, for example, our school infrastructure program, we recognize that property tax has been asked to pay a disproportionate burden of school infrastructure or school building. When you take the gaming revenues out of the general fund and you put them into a new fund, a revolving loan fund, you provide an alternative source and opportunity for funding of infrastructure, which I think takes the burden off property ownership, allows property taxes to come down in a meaningful way. At the same time, you're not jeopardizing the quality of education.
Good. Campaigns are about issues, but they're also about people.
Yeah.
What have you learned about yourself through this process? Running for governor must be quite a process, and how's that been? I mean, you know, on the personal side.
It's a great learning experience. You find yourself meeting a wide variety of individuals, from the very, very powerful to people that feel that they have no power. Sometimes it's a humbling experience. Sometimes it's an overwhelming experience, and you wonder whether anyone has the qualifications or the capability to do the job. Other times it's an extraordinarily exhilarating experience. What I've learned, I think it will take me some time to reflect. You don't have time when you're on the campaign trail to reflect much on what you're just going from one event to the next event. I will tell you that I have been extraordinarily proud of my family and their involvement in this campaign. My wife Christy has campaigned in about 70 counties and done a great job. I've been very proud of my children, who have been able to lead a fairly normal life while mom and dad are off campaigning, and they're still doing well in school, and that means a lot to me. And I've also been extraordinarily touched by the support that I've received from people all over the state, and particularly in my own Southeast area community, my Senate district, and my own hometown of Mount Pleasant. The support has been just absolutely extraordinary, and it's very gratifying.
I bet. This show will air in the middle of October. We're getting down to the end here. What do you need to do in the final weeks to take it over the top?
Well, we're very encouraged by the recent polls because Mr. Lightfoot has complete name recognition and has had complete name recognition for months. His numbers have not moved. Our numbers have continued to go up steadily as people get to know more about us. Our challenge is for the 45% of the population that still doesn't know much about me to educate them about who I am and, more importantly, what I stand for and what I'd like to do with the power that we're asking that they give to me. I think if they see who I am and what I stand for and they compare my record to Mr. Lightfoot's record, they'll see my record as a mainstream kind of record. They'll see Mr. Lightfoot's record is very extreme. For example, Joe, 51 times voted against funding for public education, voted against programs like Head Start and school nutrition programs and school-to-work opportunities and remedial reading, voted to cut that. Voted against the ADA, we've talked about that. We haven't talked much about his environment record, but the only Iowa member of Congress to vote against the Clean Air Act, suggested that we gut the Clean Water Act, voted against the federal minimum wage, wanted to abolish the minimum wage. These are fairly extreme positions, which put him out of touch with the mainstream of Iowa. And I think as people get to know that, we will pick up support.
Good. Any concern about apathy this election? I mean, everybody's saying that people are going to stay home, and what do you say to people on that point?
I don't think that's going to happen in Iowa. I really don't. I mean, the sign that you held up at the beginning of the show, 30 very long years, is very motivating to a lot of people. And there's going to be a clear choice between a candidate, myself, who stands for property tax relief coupled with a real commitment to education, against a fellow who wants to give additional tax cuts to those who have already received the benefit of the most recent tax cuts, the wealthiest. That is a very clear distinction, a very clear choice that Iowans have to make. And I have confidence that Iowans will make the right choice.
Good. Tom, thanks for being with us
Joe, thank
today,
you.
and good luck. If you'd like to get a hold of the Vilsack campaign, here's the phone number, and it's, 515-288-1998. You could give the campaign a call if you got questions or want to get involved. I'd like to thank our crew. We have Doug Allaire directing, and Derek Maurer and Phil Phillips on camera, and it was produced by yours truly. Remember, this is only a TV program. What's important is what you're doing each and every day in your community to make it a better place. We've got an election coming up. I hope you get out there and vote. We'll see you again next time.